At least the Mother of Parliaments did address the Ukrainian issue this week, which they failed to do either from the back benches or the front benches last week at PMQs. It is still very hard to pin down, though, Nick, when they say there will be consequences, what these consequences will be.
In part, that is because countries are defending their own interests. That document that the Prime Minister referred to that was seen outside Downing Street made clear that Britain didn't want to have trade sanctions and also didn't want to stop Russians investing in the City of London. So it's in part for that reason, but it's in part because there simply is an agreement. And the government are of the view, I think the US government are also of the view, that it would be a disaster for different countries to announce different things at different times. There has to be agreement. That has to come tomorrow in Brussels at the EU summit. Give you one example. David Cameron says today in Prime Minister's questions, it's hard to see, I think was the phrase he used, how the G8 summit in Sochi should go ahead. Yesterday, the Italian foreign minister said that he thought it could go ahead. Now, unless they can get agreements on this, it's no use the Prime Minister saying anything on that.
And so has the new Social Democratic foreign minister of Germany.
Yep,
said that he didn't say it should go ahead, but he wasn't sure that what he said was, but it's our chance to talk to Mr. Putin.
And this is a big factor, the German role in all this. Not only historically have the Germans been in favour of a kind of, if you like, more diplomatic approach to Russia. No wonder in a way that Berlin isn't that far away from the Black Sea when we're talking about it. So there's historical reasons, but there are also economic reasons. 30 to 40% of their oil and gas comes from Russia. But there are also political reasons. Steinmeier, the foreign minister, I've forgotten his first name, forgive me.
Frank.
He comes from the Social Democratic Party. He is an ally of Gerhard Schröder, the former Chancellor, who is on the board of Gazprom and is notably a dove when it comes to dealing with Russia. So there's always been a suggestion that Germans would resist. Having said that, pushed by Ed Miliband with this quote, Russian armies can't march into other countries while Russian shoppers march into Selfridges, the Labour leader quoting David Cameron back at himself from 6 years ago, the Prime Minister did say there would have to be more actions and implied they'd come tomorrow. My guess is that will be targeted sanctions on certain individuals in the Russian government to do with their visas and to do with their assets being frozen.
And that would be it. That's it. We're just going to pick on a few oligarchs.
I think that there are two important things that are happening. One, I think, is the encouraging news that there has been contact between the Ukrainian ministers and Russian ministers, because we do need to see a de-escalation of tension in Ukraine. The second thing I think that's important, and which follows on from what Nick said, is that the EU Council of Foreign Ministers is meeting tomorrow, and that provides an opportunity to get a much more coordinated response across the European Union to what's going on.
Well, it provides an opportunity.
But will they do anything?
But will they do anything? I mean, the Germans are the key in this, because they have the biggest trade relations with Russia. As Nick has said, they are hugely dependent on Russian oil and gas, but they also, a third of all European Union exports to Russia come from Germany. They amounted in the first 9 months of last year, 27 billion euros from Germany alone, 3 times what America exports to Russia in a whole year. At a time when the German economy is struggling to recover from recession, I really doubt Mrs. Merkel is going to agree to a trade war.
Well, the German economy is probably one of the strongest in Europe, certainly stronger than the state of our economy at the moment.
Well, actually, the British economy is growing faster.
But I think the point about Germany is that one would hope that they would recognise, along with every other EU state, the importance of sending a very strong message to.
But what would you like that strong message to be?
Well, I think there needs to be clarity from the EU Council about the timetable and steps that we need to see from President Putin. He needs to know that the European Union would be as one around a series of diplomatic events, such as attendance at the G8. And he needs to know that there would be agreement around issues such as travel bans and visa bans. And in that sense, for key individuals
for the whole of the Putin regime?
For key individuals within Russia. So that sense of risk.
Do you think Mr. Putin cares?
Well, I think he has on occasion in the past recognised that he also has a significant economic relationship with the European Union. So there are a series of economic risks for him. But
what's the risk? He is running a huge surplus with the European Union because he sends the oil and gas. No European leader can see its country run out of gas. So where's the risk?
Well, the risk is from other parts of the Russian economy. There are many businesses in Russia that trade with the European Union who will not want to break off those relationships.
Well, actually,
and see those
there aren't that
relationships
many. I mean,
affected.
most of Russia's exports to the European Union are oil and gas. That's it. When did you last buy something that was made in Russia?
I couldn't remotely tell you where I buy most of the things that I
But you
that
get
I
my
buy.
point.
Other than,
You get my point.
Other than probably Tesco.
And I just wonder whether Mr. Putin's not now hermetically sealed from all this.
I don't think so. I think there's more going on here than just trade relations. I mean, there's been a whole series of things. We mentioned Georgia, there's been problems in Moldova. We're creating a situation where Russia is surrounded by former client states, which it's attempting to weaken.
Successfully?
Yeah, in the short term.
What was
long
penalty
term,
did the Kremlin pay for grabbing 2 chunks of Georgia?
Well, long term, having weak countries on your border is not a good thing.
No, but long term, we now know. I don't know whether the Foreign Office talked to you about this, but we now know the policy of the Kremlin is basically to recreate the influence that the old Soviet Union had over the near abroad. It's countries like Georgia, it's like the Ukraine, Belarus, and so on.
But this wasn't intended. It was only the premature departure of the former president that caused this. This isn't part of Russia's policy.
Which Mr. Putin, in the press conference yesterday, insisted is the rightful leader of Ukraine and should be returned to power.
Well, nobody thinks that he is the rightful leader. I mean,
No, Mr. Putin does.
He does. apart from Mr. Putin, but I think nobody else
he's the one that
internationally.
matters.
Nobody else. I don't think that's completely true. Nobody else internationally accepts that he is the.
But what are the sanctions? I still
leader.
don't quite understand what is the punishment for, if there should be one, for Vladimir Putin for pursuing a policy that either, if he hasn't planned it, he is now pursuing.
I mean, we do need to all act together on this. Clearly, no one's going to use military sanctions on this. I mean, utterly out of
Well, no
the
one's
question.
proposed that.
Can
so
you hit
that's
them in the
also-
pocket?
That's a straw
Can you
man.
hit them in the pocket that hard, personally? His regime, his cronies. Can you hit them that hard by freezing their assets?
Well,
and
they
money?
already have been hit very hard. They are, on average, poorer by 20% than they were at the weekend
yes,
because
that's
the ruble
right. Yeah, the ruble
and the
has
stock
collapsed. Yeah,
market
absolutely, yes.
has collapsed. And
With respect, that's the kind of point I'm making. It's kind of creating a more unstable position for the regime. I mean, sooner or later, Belarus, that dictatorship there is going to face the kind of social pressures that we've seen in the Ukraine. I mean, I know that I've been to the Ukraine a number of times, and I can remember the enormous optimism in sort of the early 90s, and it's just fallen into this marasma of corruption.
there is a risk that the European Union will once again look rather weak.
There is a risk
And
of
divided.
that. There is a sense, though, I think, that all leaders will have that you don't hold a meeting unless you know that you're going to say something at the end of it. And it has to be more than merely saying something. You actually have to do something at the end of it. I thought it was interesting that the Prime Minister was saying that he'd have meetings with Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande in the morning. I don't know if that's as a troika, as the three of them, or whether he's meeting them separately at this stage. But it suggests to me that there will be awareness amongst those leaders. They cannot afford to go to Brussels for an emergency summit on Ukraine, having issued those sort of condemnatory words, and not then have something substantial. Now, you may be right, Andrew, that people will then say, well, is that it at the end? But I think they know they've got to say something. And what was interesting is that John Kerry yesterday, the US Secretary of State, sounded as if he was partly putting pressure on Europe, but partly beginning to gain confidence that Europe might just be about to do something, which would be hitting two things, wouldn't it? Be hitting Russia's international standing and Putin's ego. In other words, the Sochi summit is actually rather important to him, given the amount of money he's spent on building that city, for rebuilding the city for the Winter Olympics, and also hitting the kind of lives of people around the administration. But I agree with you, it's very hard to see trade sanctions.
It was interesting that it was after the Russian stock market went into freefall and after the ruble hit its lowest level in recorded history, even though the Kremlin spent 10% of its massive reserves trying to prop the ruble up, that Mr. Putin announced that a stand down of the army on the border with East Ukraine. So that would at least suggest
it did have an effect.
Financial, it may not be sanctions or anything that your governments, European governments would do, but that finances do play a role for Mr. Putin.
Yes.
So we shall see. One final point?
One final point is, we can't see it here, but my colleagues are sort of tweeting away about it. Sam Cam, the Prime Minister's wife, was in the gallery watching Prime Minister's questions.
Why do we think that was?
I've no idea, but we know she's only done it, we think, once since David Cameron was Prime Minister, and maybe she fancies seeing how he's getting on. making sure that if next May they have to move house, she's got some happy memories.
It's always nice. Many question times left. So
it's always nice when the wife turns up of a day. Nick, thank you very much.